All right, everyone, what's good? Welcome back to the Brawn and Brains podcast. Obviously, last time we went through the fundamentals of training. Now we are coming at you with our second education series episode, the fundamentals of nutrition. Again, obviously, me, Kev Gomez, my friend Ben Stanners here. We've received some really good feedback, so we hope that you
Yep.
enjoy this episode and that we can both provide you again with some kind of fish as well as kind of teaching you how to fish. That seems to kind of be the main kind of feedback that we're teaching people to apply things, which is all good to hear.
hmm
But I guess without further ado, there's a decent amount to cover. Ben and I've already had kind of one crack at this and are now trying to kind of strip it back. So without further ado, we will get straight into the fundamentals of nutrition. I guess a good starting place for that is in the very, very basics, both in terms of kind of nutrition itself and in terms of just immediately things that we can kind of apply when looking at kind of achieving goals and progressing. Energy balance. So I don't know
hmm
if Ben, you want to go in on that.
Yeah, that's a key place to start because that really is a fundamental of nutrition. So yes, first of all, me and Kev had a crack at this already, but unfortunately, we just like to talk, so it was too long. So we thought, right, let's pick out the key parts and strip it back. So yeah, anyway, energy balance. That is a fundamental law. That is a physical law. So first thing that needs to be said is that you will see a lot of people try to dispute it and say it's not really relevant to everyone or doesn't apply to everyone, but it's a fundamental law. It's a physical law. It's a law of physics. So it applies to everyone, no matter who you are, no matter if you deny it or not, it applies to everyone. Now, obviously, a lot of the people who say that it doesn't apply to everyone just tend to misinterpret what energy balance or psycho carries in, carries out actually is and what influences it. So hopefully today, one of our main goals is to really clear up what energy balance or psycho is. And so that's obviously, a key takeaway from all of this to understand to begin with, because energy balance very much dictates what you can achieve or what you're trying to achieve in the sense that, if your goal is fat loss, then obviously you want to be in a calorie deficit. If your goal is to build muscle, then ideally you want to be in a high energy environment, aka a calorie surplus. Now, obviously, there is a little bit of controversy to say maybe you can build muscle still in a calorie maintenance or maybe even in a calorie deficit. It's definitely possible, but it's certainly not optimal. So if you want to really just ensure you're going to be able to build muscles, then yes, you want to be to a calorie surplus. The third energy environment is a calorie maintenance. Now, it's a calorie maintenance is a little bit different in the sense that it's less of a fixed number and more of a range. So what I mean by that is if your calorie maintenance was say like 2,000 calories per day, it's more likely to be between 1,800 to 2,200 calories per day. So again, that's just I'm making up numbers there, but it's just to show you that is more of a range. And like I said, depending on which energy state you want to be in is very much dependent on your goal.
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point for it. Obviously, good touching on the idea that it's a law because a lot of people do kind of misinterpret that.
Yeah.
I guess immediately one avenue which we can explore is kind of the misinterpretation of calories in, calories out versus actually kind of tracking calories before we kind of even
Yes.
get a little more before we even get a little more granular on the idea of what kind of constitutes calories in, calories out. I guess immediately kind of clearing up one myth in terms of application, the way that people
Yeah.
actually try to do this in their everyday life or in a
Mhm.
dieting phase. One thing which gets under my skin, I know it does under yours as well, Ben, is obviously some people then taking this idea to the extreme and perhaps looking at it basically and realizing that calories in, calories out is physics, it is thermodynamics, but then almost taking that to the extreme and suggesting that well, without tracking calories there's therefore no way that you can lose weight, when that's really a misinterpretation,
Mhm.
because we don't have to track every single calorie that goes into us to ensure that we are creating the energy environment that we require for our goals. When we simply consider things like portion sizes and potentially even looking at different food sources and macronutrients and more kind of intuitive ways to diet, it becomes apparent that tracking calories isn't the only way to go, even though we are still looking at calories in, calories out. You know, when we consider potentially client implications of people who may not have such a good relationship with food, and you know, if tracking can potentially lead to more obsessive behaviors, which could become harmful down the line. Again, this isn't us trying to dispute calories in, calories out. This is us saying people will actually misinterpret it, because, you know, it's one thing to you know, understand that those energy environments are required, but it's another thing to say that we need to actually be, you know, counting the calories. And this is where kind of the other kind of diet camps will then get thrown in the mix, because other people will be like, oh well, calories in, calories out doesn't matter because I was on keto and I lost X amount of weight and I wasn't counting calories. Like but you will have still been achieving a calorie deficit through that keto diet. So it's still calories in versus calories out.
Yes. And that's critical to understand. Counting calories is a tool. Calories in, calories out is a physical law. They're not the same thing whatsoever. Again, like you just said, you know, people will say, well, I didn't count calories and I still lost weight. Yes, you might not count calories because you don't have to, but you were still in a calorie deficit. That didn't negate the fact you were still in a calorie deficit. One is a tool, one is a physical law. Like you said, it's the law of thermodynamics. So you can't dispute it by saying I didn't count calories, because it's not the same thing. And that's a massive misinterpretation that I always see far too often. Yes, it does typically come from the low carb zealots who just, again, seem to confuse counting calories with the law of thermodynamics, or calories in, calories out. Not the same thing. Again, that needs to be really, really clear. And to be fair, that is good to know, because I think long term, I don't think anyone should have to track calories anyway. Because realistically, I mean, do you really want to be tracking calories for the rest of your life? I know certainly that I don't. In fact, I'm at the point where I don't need to, unless I was in a competition prep where I need to be a bit more optimal, so to speak. But but on the whole, does anyone really want to track calories for the rest of life? No. So just use it as a tool to help you to learn and get a bit more understanding of the food that you're eating, the calorie content, the macro content, the micronutrient content, foods that you actually enjoy, foods maybe that you don't enjoy. Use that as a tool to learn, and it might take a couple of years, but use it as a tool to learn first. And then whilst you're doing that, learn things like mindfulness and starting to listen to hunger cues and recognize the difference between hunger cues and boredom, so that eventually you don't have to track calories and you can just, use these other skills to still, if you needed to, create a calorie deficit or calorie maintenance or calorie surplus. And that should be the ultimate goal anyway. So yeah, one is a tool, but it doesn't negate the fact that you still have this law of calories in, calories out. So yeah, that is definitely a myth we need to dispel straight away. There are other myths which we could dispel, but I think we'll leave that till after or for a bit, because now I think what we should talk about is what affects calories in and what affects calories out. So calories in is affected by less. So calories in essentially is just the food that you eat. Now, it is also affected by things like hormones, because you have hunger hormones. So you have a hormone called ghrelin, which again is literally just a hunger hormone. It sort of regulates that hunger feeling. And you have a hormone called leptin, which is like an energy regulating hormone. So again, if your body senses you're low in energy, leptin will go up and you will essentially get hungry and it'll make you eat, sort of thing. It also is affected by things like the gut microbiome. Now, I don't want to get too deep into that because that's when things can start to get a little bit complicated. But essentially, you do have certain species in the gut. You do have certain species in the gut microbiome, some which will produce energy themselves, some which are better extracting energy from your food. So obviously that can affect calories in as well. Now, calories out has a lot more which affects it. So it has your BMR, your exercise, your NEAT, your NEPA, and the TEF. It also, again, is affected by things like hormones. So again, that's another myth we need to dispel, is the fact that, yes, a lot of people will say, well, calories out doesn't account for hormones. Yes, it does. Yes, it absolutely does account for hormones. Yeah. It accounts for hormones on both sides of the equation. It accounts for hormones in terms of how they can affect how calories in can affect calories out and vice versa. It very much accounts for hormones. So anyway, your BMR is your basal metabolic rate. which is essentially is how many calories you need to survive if you're in a coma for your body still to perform its absolute necessary functions. Your exercise, well, everyone knows what exercise is. Obviously, that does have a calorie load, which you are burning through. Your NEAT and your NEPA are two slightly different things. So your NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and NEPA is non-exercise physical activity. Now, you could put them both under NEAT, but the reason why I think, or I like to keep them separate, is because one you have more control over and one you have less control over. So NEAT is things like this. When I'm moving my hands and talking like this is NEAT. Even talking itself is NEAT. Blinking is NEAT. The way you sit is NEAT. And that's important to understand because when you're dieting, your body, to try and conserve energy, because it likes homeostasis, will start to down-regulate those things. So you'll actually talk slower, you'll blink slower, you'll be less likely to sit upright because, again, that expends more energy. It doesn't seem like that would save much energy, but add that up over time, and it really does. Whereas your non-exercise physical activity is things like your steps, which you do have control over. So if you set a step target, obviously, you can still hit that regardless of if you feel low energy or not. And then lastly, you have the TEF. That's the thermic effect of food. So essentially what that is it's the amount of calories it takes to digest, absorb, and utilize and metabolize the food that you're eating. Again, when we get onto the macronutrients in a bit, we'll sort of talk about the different thermic effects of food from each macronutrient as well. So that's just the ways in which separately calories in is affected and separately calories out is affected. They do also affect each other. I don't know if you want to sort of talk about that. So you can talk for a bit.
Yeah, sure. So I think a good one that you kind of already got started on, so I think is a good one to just kind of immediately now delve into. And again, I guess kind of looking more so at kind of what people maybe get wrong when dieting is that idea of kind of adaptive thermogenesis and the idea of your body kind of down regulating, its activity and stuff to try and create homeostasis, because of course your body adapts and it wants this kind of environment where everything is as normal as possible, really. So as you said, particularly when looking at the NEAT side of things, when you are kind of dieting and such, you will probably find that even those little things that you said people may not even really consider, like blinking slower, talking slower, the way they sit. If you often watch like interviews of bodybuilders, like just a couple of weeks out from a competition, and obviously they're on rock bottom calories and stuff, you'll often see them sat like really hunched over, because that's how your body can conserve some energy. And that's kind of important to consider, because of course this is the idea of if we are expending more energy and creating a calorie deficit, our body will compensate by trying to conserve energy.
Yeah.
And when we consider kind of the implications of this dieting, this is where a lot of people kind of fall into the trap of the more is better and just push harder, when in reality this is probably a good idea to consider, well, if calories in and calories out kind of do have this relationship with each other and can interact in this kind of way, then this is when we can kind of look at can upping food really make it more efficient to in the long term, especially to diet, because of the effects that it can then have on kind of making things a lot easier in terms of actually being able to expend more energy. Because obviously we have, as you touched on, the idea of NEPA to kind of be able to combat a sort of down regulation in NEAT, so we can do more steps and stuff like that to combat that. But even that is going to feel like significantly more effort, because that's our body's kind of attempt at trying to get us to stop expending so much energy, and it would rather try to make us feel more effort doing those things, so we don't want to really do that.
And that's critical to understand, because everyday tasks will feel like more effort. Now, not going to go too deep into that, because we do have another video. This comes out on Friday. I think the following Wednesday we have a video on creating an efficient diet and start point, where we actually start to go into that. So we're not gonna say too much more on that. But everyday tasks will start to feel like more effort, which in itself is problematic. Now, again, like you say, adaptive thermogenesis is one of the big ways in which carries in can affect carries out, and vice versa. Just to correct myself, before I did say that in a low energy environment, leptin would go up, leptin would actually go down. So that's important to understand though for adaptive thermogenesis, because if leptin's going down, it means your body's trying to conserve energy. So if you're in a low energy environment, aka you're not eating much per day, then your body again will conserve that energy to try and bring your calories out down and be in this energy balance homeostasis environment. And again, this comes with all sorts of problems. So this is where you can start to run into these hormonal problems again. Leptin's coming down, ghrelin's coming up. So that's, your energy regulating hormone is low, whereas your hunger hormone is high. So you're going to become very food focused. This is when, again, cravings are going to go up. If you really get it wrong, this is where you could start to develop this binge restrict cycle. But, again, outside of that, that's also when things like performances can start to get impacted. If performance is impacted, then, in terms of results are not going to be as good. So you can start to see straight away how what people previously thought independent factor of calories in now directly affects calories out, and how they have a direct relationship with each other, and how, again, you can't look at them as two separate factors. One affects the other. Fortunately, the reverse can be said to be true in the fact that if you eat more, you're also going to move more, because your body will upregulate its energy outlet essentially. So that's useful to know as well, because again, when we look at creating an efficient diet style point, if we can get calories as high as possible, again, it's going to come with a lot of benefits. But again, we'll save that for on Wednesday when you watch that video. So stay tuned for that. Now, other ways in which carries out can affect carries in, or vice versa, is if we look at something like cardio. Now, first of all, absolutely do your cardio. Do your cardio for sure. Don't neglect cardio, because cardio is important for a lot of things. But for some people, doing cardio will upregulate levels of ghrelin. Again, ghrelin is that hunger hormone. So if you're getting higher levels of this hunger hormone, you're more likely to overeat. So you might think, I need to do cardio for fat loss, but actually that's causing you to overeat. Then you can see how that is a direct issue for fat loss. Now, I'm not necessarily saying don't do cardio. In fact, definitely do cardio, but you might have to just take a more strategic approach. Number one, I definitely wouldn't do it fasted. I mean, it doesn't make a difference in terms of fat loss if we do it fasted or not anyway, but I definitely wouldn't do it fasted. And maybe look to do a little bit less cardio, and maybe just increase your steps or something as a way to increase your output, again, just to help manage the hunger better, because obviously, again, that is critical for fat loss, to stop you from overeating, because if you're overeating, then you're not going to be in a calorie deficit. So they're just pretty key considerations you have to take into account of, what affects calories in, what affects calories out, and how they influence and directly affect each other. Again, that's just really, really important to understand. But is there anything else you want to add to that, or do you want to move on to the macros?
Just kind of a quick one to wrap that up. Actually, I think that the cardio thing, that was one I was waiting for you to touch on, because I think that kind of ties up this whole idea of hopefully what people can really take away from this first kind of subsection of energy balance, which is the idea that more isn't necessarily better. Understand that, although we do have these fundamental principles like calories in, calories out, which is going to really underpin everything, it's still worth noting that these concepts aren't really to be abused, because they do have kind of relationships in the ways that they interact with each other, and that can actually just end up screwing you up in the long term in terms of your goal. Because it is, you see it all the time where someone's dieting on like 1,500 calories and just pushing lower and lower and more cardio, and then they're on 1,200 calories and 20,000 steps and half an hour of cardio a day, and it's where do you go from there? The answer is nowhere, because when you do push much further, eventually you're going to get to the point where all these kind of things are built up, and you do end up getting into those kind of nasty cycles.
So essentially what that is a very high stress load onto the body, and again, too much stress is the destroyer of health. So this is when you can start to run into hormonal problems in both a low energy environment and a high stress environment. So this is where things like you can lose the menstrual cycle if you're a female. This is also where you could have like low libido. So that affects both men and women, and that was very much suggest that someone would have like low testosterone. Again, obviously, if you have either low testosterone or you don't have normal levels of testosterone, that's going to affect things like performance, muscle building, but also quality of life as well. So we'll not go too much into the possible issues that could be caused because there's a lot, but just overall, you could cause some serious hormonal issues that might take a long time to come back. Unfortunately, it's common for especially females to lose their menstrual cycle and for it not to come back for a very long time. And again, that is literally life-changing because menstrual cycle means you can't have kids. So you almost have to understand the possible risks when dieting if you get it wrong, because there are many. We've touched on a few, hormonal issues, relationship with food, or mental health issues as well. Just a lot of potential issues that actually do or could come with dieting. So that's just something that's important to keep in mind and understand before you do diet. And again, for our video on Wednesday, that's why it's really important to create an efficient diet start point. Okay, so let's move on to the macros now. So you have 3 main macronutrients. Technically, you have 4. Well, not you actually do have 4, and that is protein, carbs, fats. And pause the video here and take a guess. Write in the comments what you think the 4th macronutrient is. Okay, hope you've guessed. So the 4th macronutrient is ethanol or alcohol. Now, ethanol and works pretty similar in terms of carbs, in terms of an energy source, but obviously it is also toxic, which if you've ever woke up with a hangover before, you know all about.
You should know.
Now, the way it slightly differs though is because obviously, protein has 4 calories per gram, carbs has 4 calories per gram, fat has 9 calories per gram, and ethanol has 7 calories per gram. So there is a slightly different calorie value to carbs that also needs to be said. So that's the very basics of macros. Do you want to add anything to the basics first before we start to get onto how they, affect you?
Yeah, well, I think obviously, it's the idea. For starters, I guess this is where we can kind of get into the idea of diminishing returns for results and how we kind of apply things to us. What I really mean by that is essentially, if you weren't previously, considering energy balance and calories and how they apply to your goal in terms of kind of energy environment and calorie surplus versus deficit, etc., you're already going to reap a ton of reward just from implementing like that very basic concept into whatever phase you're in now. If you were then kind of breaking it up into kind of macronutrients and kind of meeting your macro targets per day, we're reaping a little more progress from that, and then all other things we kind of talk on about reaping a little more progress from that, even though really everything that we are discussing today is pretty basic, even when we do kind of get into the idea of kind of distributing these nutrients and stuff, which we'll move on to in a little bit. So really, you probably should be able to implement like everything we talk about from this video. It's nothing that complicated. But obviously this is now just kind of breaking things down a little more from overall calorie intake and energy balance. I think what's also kind of important to establish now is we're going to pretty much gloss over what these macronutrients do in terms of kind of their role in your body and through your diet. But obviously that's information that's very easily accessible, and even though that's the first thing people try to post about on Instagram with cute little infographics as soon as they've done their level 3 PT qual, we are here to really kind of consider how you can actually apply these to your diet. So we'll kind of glimpse over that, and then we'll kind of discuss some pretty cool ideas in terms of how we can actually structure our diet in terms of considerations with macronutrients to actually really influence our results from kind of a multitude of avenues, from everything like satiety and adherence to even just sort of the potential recomposition abilities of how we structure our diets. So I don't know if we should just quickly kind of go over what these do in terms of their role and then get into the real fun stuff.
Well, we'll take it one macronutrient at a time. So we'll just start with protein. So first of all, protein, everyone knows protein is for muscle building, but that is certainly not what it's definitely not what it's all it's for at all. Like, there are so many different types of proteins within the body. It affects a lot of different tissues within the body. So, obviously from your actual skeletal muscle to your skin itself, to things like the immune system, and even things like digestion as well. But again, we want to stay with the fundamentals here. So just know that there is many different roles of protein is just key to keep in mind, because when we get onto protein intake in a bit, that's just important to remember. So protein is wonderful. Regardless of what your goal is, protein is wonderful. So let's start with fat loss. So protein and fat loss. So there was a study, I believe, by Kevin Hall, which was a crossover study. So what that means is a group will do one variable and then it'll cross over and do the other variable. So they are their own control, which is a pretty good study, to be fair. So that study basically looked at calorie equated diets and high protein versus low protein. And here's the key. They were in a calorie maintenance. Now, the group that was on when they switched over to the high protein diet, what actually happened because of this thermic effect of food, which protein's thermic effect of food is about, I think, anywhere between 20 to 35%. So what that means is if you consumed 100 calories of protein, you'd only extract about 70 calories worth of that out of the 100. So the group that were, again, in this calorie maintenance that were consuming high protein actually ended up being in a small deficit, despite the fact that calories were at maintenance, ended up being a small deficit because of this thermic effect of the protein intake. So what does that mean? Well, it means if you're going to go for fat loss, we know by consuming higher protein, we can elicit a little bit more of a calorie deficit without necessarily having to drop the calories themselves. Again, this is just another way in which we can look at how calories in affects calories out. So that's pretty cool. It is pretty cool. And again, it's just really practical and useful information to know straight away why you should probably go high protein if your goal is fat loss. Now, it also is good news for those who are looking to do a body recomposition, because essentially what that means is it means to lose fats, but at the very least try and maintain or even gain muscle at the same time. We know the importance of protein and muscle building. So again, going higher protein is just going to make it an easier environment to gain muscle. But as I said at the start, if your goal is to gain muscle, then ideally you want to be in a high energy environment. So if you can have calories as high as possible, but still meet a small deficit by doing higher protein, again, you'll get more energy availability to be able to build muscle. And again, things like performance, but actually the actual tissue repair and rebuild is going to be a lot easier for your body to do because you're eating more calories. So regardless of your goal, protein has some pretty cool effects and it's pretty beneficial to pretty much everyone. Now, obviously, protein also has what you call a high satiety rate, which essentially means it's more satisfying and fills you up easier. So in terms of fat loss, again, it's easier to then not overeat because you're getting filled up and more satisfied from eating the protein. So again, that's another benefit of going high protein. Now, this is where we then have to dispel a couple of myths. And the reason being is maybe it will help to convince you that there isn't really a downside of going high protein. So myth number one, and this is something that I've posted about plenty before, especially on my Instagram story, is that you've heard the myth that you can only absorb 30 grams of protein in one meal. That is utter bullshit, to be honest with you. So yes, there is a slight limit, or there is a limit to how much protein is needed for muscle protein synthesis or an anabolic response, but that is still more than 30 grams. It seems to be around 40 to 50 grams. But as we said, and again, this is why I want you to keep in mind, protein is used for a lot more than just muscle building. So there is no known limit to how much protein you can actually absorb in one meal or in one go. So again, it will have this limit for this anabolic threshold, but it will then just use the rest of the protein for whatever it needs it for, essentially. It's not just going to go, nope, not having that. It will just use it for whatever it needs. There's many different things it could need. It could, if it even wanted to, turn it into energy by essentially, because protein can turn into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. So if it needed to, it could even, turn that protein into an available energy source. But again, there's just many different functions of protein. So there is no known limit to how much you can absorb in one meal. So again, don't think you have to only stick to 30 grams and that's it. The second thing we need to cover is, again, lots of people have heard, well, high protein or specifically high animal products. Now, again, in terms of quality of protein, you do want to go for mainly animal products because it's a high quality, more bioavailable protein source. But then people go, well, isn't that associated with high risk of cancer? So again, there was a good study. Sorry, I can't remember who this was by, but we'll link it below. Basically looking at, I think it was an epidemiological study. So it just looks at the population. And it basically looked at different groups. So, some who would eat in low amounts of meat and low amounts of veg, some were eating high amounts of meat and low amounts of veg, some were eating high amounts of veg and low amounts of meat, some who were eating high amounts of meat and high amounts of veg. Again, pause the video and tell me which group you think was at the lowest risk of cancer. Okay, so the group that was at the lowest risk of cancer was the group that ate the highest amount of meat and the highest amount of veg. So essentially, if you have a high meat intake, then you can offset that with a high veg intake. And that, again, is a really practical and key takeaway to remember, because, again, if we're telling you to go high protein, and we're telling you all of these benefits of going high protein regardless of your goal, you might obviously still be worried about potential cancer risk. Well, again, the good news is as long as you keep your veg intake nice and high, which is basically 5+ servings per day, then you're probably going to be okay. In fact, you're going to be at the lowest risk of cancer. So to sum that up again, you don't need to limit how much protein you're eating in one meal, because it can be used, protein is used for multiple different things within the body. And if you are going to eat high protein, just make sure you eat high veg as well. Anything you want to add to protein?
I think there's still some cool things to touch on. Obviously, a lot already kind of touched on there, even kind of looking at kind of the clinical side of things, which I think some people might not have really considered as much. That they might just be kind of considering, well, what can I do to build more muscle? But that's obviously a good one to consider, just in terms of kind of considering health and longevity, and if you actually want to continue building muscle for very long. But yeah, eat your vegetables in short. I think it was cool to touch on the ideas of both kind of the thermic effect and satiety in regards to kind of fat loss. It was good to touch on the idea of meat and the bioavailability of protein. Obviously, considering that not all protein sources are equal in terms of their amino acid content. And especially when we then kind of start to consider kind of the impacts on muscle protein synthesis, which you brought up, it is obviously important to actually be considering, good sources of protein being consumed as opposed to kind of incomplete sources, which may not have the amino acids that we're looking for. I think that actually in itself, kind of talking, before I get onto the MPS side of things, another quick one is the idea of high protein and kind of recomping effect. You kind of touched on this in terms of the importance of protein to build muscle. But I think there are even kind of studies out there showing that almost, way higher protein than people would really consider. I think I could get this wrong, but we'll link it below. But it was like a silly high amount of protein, and the idea of, I think it might have been like 2.5 grams per pound of body weight.
Yeah, I've seen even high. Like I've seen up to, I'm sure it was like something as crazy high as 4 grams per pound. Right. I was like, something crazy high.
Well, studies out there have shown that like these super high intakes of protein have really helped kind of recomposition, which comes back to that idea of, in certain circumstances being able to build muscle in a calorie deficit. And even though, potentially, a lower energy environment, if we are kind of looking at a very high protein intake, can we potentially look to kind of build muscle and lose fat in the same time? It's possible. Again, not trying to dispel kind of calories in, calories out, and kind of the basic rules of energy environments. But if one was watching this and they were trying to consider, well, if I really did want to be super meticulous with everything I put in myself, and to get those results that I wanted, then yeah, potentially when we're looking at a very, very high protein intake, you could actually pull that off if everything else was in order as well, which I guess is a good kind of way to segue on to, therefore, how much protein should we be eating, especially when we kind of consider the ideas of muscle protein synthesis and complete versus incomplete protein, and its kind of impacts on gaining muscle, recomping, losing fat, how much should we actually be looking to, consume? I think there's obviously the general rule of thumb for bodybuilders, and I guess a quick disclaimer is obviously, athletes and people involved in physical activity are going to need higher protein intakes than is just recommended on average. I think the NHS recommendation for protein is kind of pitiful. It's around
like 50 grams per day.
Something grams, yeah. So
pitiful.
if you're having your 50 grams of protein, then you're probably not going to build very much muscle eating that.
It's far too low.
We're probably on a good 4 times that at least. But with that being said, when we think about, if more protein could potentially lead to, more muscle protein synthesis, more potential for muscle gain, but, more satiety in regards to fat loss, then, shouldn't we just eat as much protein as kind of possible? And the answer to that is no, because then the caveat of sort of digestion comes into play. And obviously protein is something that's, a lot more effort to kind of digest. And, I guess you hear it kind of all the time in gym culture when it comes to kind of the protein farts and stuff. It's just kind of as a very basic one. But yeah, then if we kind of look at, the idea of, I can't remember who said this, but, the idea of you're not being what you eat, but more the idea of you are what you eat, digest, absorb, and don't excrete. Shout out to the muscle mentors.
I believe that was Dr. Brian Walsh, actually.
Right. Okay. So yeah, shout out Dr. Brian as well. We'll kind of touch more on digestion, kind of the lifestyle side of things, because I think there's a lot to be said about kind of the implications of things like stress and sleep and stuff on digestion. So digestion is more of a topic we'll kind of discuss more on the lifestyle education, but it's worth kind of already implanting that idea in your head of kind of the influence of nutrition on digestion, and us actually looking to absorb what we eat to be able to really utilize it. And therefore, again, more isn't necessarily better in these scenarios, because if we're not actually absorbing the protein that we're wanting to from these, then we're not really going to reap the benefits of having these silly high protein consumptions. And I guess a good one to kind of quickly throw on at the end before I let you kind of add anything on that you want is then this idea of muscle protein synthesis and kind of distributing protein throughout the day, because then we can kind of look at, well, say we want to take in 200 grams of protein. Is it the same getting, a 30-gram serving of protein in and a 170-gram serving in, or potentially kind of distributing those a little more evenly? And I think the literature currently shows that, a good 4 servings of protein are optimal to keep muscle protein synthesis elevated throughout the day. So then we can almost look into kind of people's lifestyle and breakfast and how they sort that out. So as a fundamental rule, we do want to kind of keep our protein pretty much equally distributed throughout the day. It doesn't have to be perfect. And hopefully a takeaway that you can already get from this is you might be thinking, well, for breakfast, I had a bowl of cornflakes, which obviously doesn't have much protein in it. And that's something that I don't know about you, Ben, but it's usually kind of the first thing that I sort of implement with my clients in terms of kind of protein intake, and the idea of, well, in terms of daily target, we're not doing too bad, but if we could perhaps look at how we distribute this protein and consider taking in more in a breakfast, which is, really easy. There's no rule to say that you have to have your whey protein after training. You could just have it in the morning, or if you like cooking eggs or protein yogurt, there are really some easy things that we can do. But this is a really low hanging fruit that I hope people can take in terms of, optimizing results and thinking about kind of distribution of protein and its effect on muscle protein synthesis. But again, the same caveat comes into play whereas we can look at, well, should we just have like 7, 8, 9 serving feedings of protein a day to keep our muscle protein synthesis elevated? And again, the answer is, well, think of digestion. Do you fancy, trying to pile down some potentially pretty hefty protein feedings every couple of hours? Are you going to have a fun time digesting that? And potentially for kind of the intermittent fasting crowd, are you going to enjoy 2 massive 100-gram servings of protein or whatever you're trying to get in, and are you going to have a fun time digesting that?
And there's a few key things to take away from that there. So Yes, especially in terms of just lifestyle. Your breakfast, as Kev said, that doesn't have to dramatically change. We're not saying go from eat from a bowl of cornflakes to go and eat into a massive piece of steak in the morning. That's not realistic or sustainable, and it doesn't fit your lifestyle. But good options there. You could, rather than milk, you could mix it with some whey protein, pour that over your cornflakes. You could have a protein yogurt. If you like eggs, which most people do, you could have some eggs. So there's very easy options in which you could do that. As a generic guideline, then yeah, as you said, 4 meals, but roughly really anywhere between 3 to 6 meals or protein servings per day is going to be optimal. Anywhere in that range is absolutely fine. And then, as you said, an even distribution is going to be really important. So again, taking the typical person who at most is probably going to be eating like 100 grams of protein per day. Typically, their day would look something like, again, that bowl of cornflakes, so pretty much no protein in the morning. Their lunch might be something like 20 grams of protein, and then their dinner might be 80 grams of protein. Not very well distributed or not particularly even. So ideally, again, for muscle protein synthesis, but also for things like satiety, you want to have pretty much an even intake within each meal. It doesn't have to be perfect, but again, taking that example of 100 grams and you were having, say, 4 meals per day, you want to have around 25 grams per meal. Again, this is going to stimulate that anabolic response, but also is going to, again, help to fill you up and keep you satisfied from that meal as well. So that is really important. So yeah, in terms of structure, that's pretty much how it should look. So next we can talk about my favorite word, or my favorite macro, carbohydrates, because carbs are wonderful and you should eat carbs. So that's, I kind of wanted to spell the myth first. So carbs, when I say carbs, a lot of keto people are now currently hiding their closet because they think insulin and they've got scared, so they had to go hide away. Insulin is not your enemy, especially when it comes to fat loss. It is especially not your enemy when it comes to muscle building, but it is not your enemy when it comes to fat loss. So the myth: insulin does put you into a fat storage mode. Now, if I was just to leave it there, or you to turn this off now, you would have the complete wrong idea, because you'd be looking at the one side. So you can look at insulin or fat loss as a two-sided coin. It's fat loss is essentially, or fat gain is essentially how much fat you're storing versus how much fat you're burning. So if you spike insulin through eating carbohydrates or protein, because protein is pretty insulinogenic as well, then yes, you will acutely, which means temporarily, go into a fat storing mode. But if you want to carry deficit overall, you're going to burn more fat or body fat than you are going to store. So the net balance is this loss of body fat. So if you're, again, referring to like keto, if you're eating high fat, yes, because they try to sell this, keto is good for fat loss because you burn all the fat. So yes, if you are keto, you are burning a lot of fat, but you're also storing a lot of fat. So that's high fat, low carb. If you're high carb, low fat, yes, you're not burning very much fat, but you're also not storing very much fat either. So again, either way, it's the same. It's just it just comes down to that balance. It comes down to the difference between how much you're storing versus how much you're burning. And again, that's critical to remember. And that's essentially why insulin or carbohydrates are not the enemy of fat loss. Again, it's just looking at one pathway in one isolated moment by saying insulin is the enemy. It's not. Plus, insulin, obviously, sensitivity does matter, but you'll get more insulin sensitive as you in a calorie deficit anyway. So again, it's just silly to say that insulin is going to stop you from losing fat, because it's not. So yeah, carbs are pretty wonderful, because carbs are going to be your main fuel source for things like your exercise and your performance. So obviously, if you're eating enough carbohydrates, you're going to perform well. If you perform well, this means you're going to get better results, which is really important. And again, carbohydrate has a slightly higher thermic effect than, say, fat. So again, around 10%. So again, if you're eating 100 calories of carbs, you would get about 90% of those calories in total. But again, depending on the source, it can actually be anywhere from 5 to 15%. But let's say 10 because it's right in the middle. So interestingly, the thing about carbohydrate is, again, I can't remember exactly what the study was or how it's even performed, so I apologize for that. but again, we'll link it below. But basically, they were looked at your actual like the fat stored on the body, and they found that only around 4% of that total body fat was contributed because from glucose, essentially. That's it, just 4%. So again, that should be really positive sign for you to take away and understand that actually, again, carbs are not your enemy. Carbs help you to fuel your performance, and they're not so easily stored as body fat. In fact, they have to go through a process called de novo lipogenesis to be turned into fat in the first place to be able to be stored. Again, that itself is an energy costing process. Mm-hmm. So again, there isn't, it's not like eat carbs or even eat sugar and it just turns to fat. That's not the case at all. And that's just one of the main myths we need to dispel first. Don't have to worry about eating carbs. And again, on the flip side, eating enough carbs is going to fuel that performance. If you fuel performance, it's going to mean, again, better results. And again, not looking at training from an energy expenditure point of view, because I don't like that. But just if you're better performance, it means you're training harder, which means you're expending more calories as well. So yeah, carbs are critical and you should eat your carbs. Plus, they're enjoyable as well. So yes, eat your carbohydrates.
Yeah, no, good, great starting point for that one there. Quickly, side note on kind of going back to the insulin thing, because you kind of quickly brought it up, but I think it's worth highlighting to people kind of how prevalent this actually is. You mentioned protein being insulinogenic, but I don't think people realize that, things like whey protein almost have like a similar, an insulin spike effect as things like sugar, literally like pure sugar. So, if your argument for kind of keto or low carbs is the insulin thing, then stop eating protein at all, because really you're not gonna stop an insulin response. So just
educate yourself. Again, it's this fault of looking at one pathway in one moment in time that is drawn this wrong conclusion. The body is so complicated. You can't just look at one thing and just take a conclusion from it. You have to look at how everything interacts together and how everything works on the whole. Plus, sometimes you just have to stop looking at mechanisms and just look at what is happening in real life. There is plenty of people who have lost body fat whilst eating plenty of carbohydrates. It happens all the time. So how does some people still think that if you eat carbs, you'll gain fat? It's not understandable to me how people could think that. And that's also why, again, as long as you're in a calorie deficit, it doesn't actually matter what you eat, you will lose body fat. Now, obviously, food quality absolutely matters, but just understanding that for fat loss, the absolute fundamental is this calorie deficit, and it doesn't matter what you eat. It doesn't matter how you structure your macros, you will lose fat. Again, don't take that with a pinch of salt, because understanding, again, food quality matters, your macro distribution matters a little bit. Again, in terms of, we look at like protein, if you have a higher protein diet, then you're going to lose more fat. So again, it doesn't matter. But the fundamental is this calorie deficit means fat loss. So again, it doesn't matter if you're eating high carb, because you will lose fat as long as you're in a calorie deficit. And again, that's just critical to understand, because, if you become afraid of carbs, then again, what could that potentially do to your relationship with food? What could that do to your enjoyability of the diet? And then how could that therefore affect sustainability? Again, it might affect things like performance. And if performance sucks, then again, the results in the gym are going to be very poor. So again, this is almost this knock-on effect from an irrational fear of carbohydrate. So
I wanted to come to that actually, because I think one thing that people don't consider is, again, kind of the indirect impact of doing that, because obviously, particularly, I guess, perhaps we can sort of touch on the idea of, therefore, why are carbs important, in the gym. And obviously we kind of touch on this in a Fitbit that we've got coming out in a few weeks anyway, which kind of touches on the idea of matching nutrition to training. But basically, to not get too into it, I guess, especially if you're kind of training in a more kind of metabolic manner,
which is that feel the burn style.
Then you're going to be, relying on glucose a lot more anyway. So particularly if you are in a phase of training that is more that style, then consider your consumption of carbohydrates and how that will be affecting your performance, and particularly how it kind of, your nutrition does relate to your training. I think that in itself, the idea of, even if it kind of does work just solely looking at weight loss, is that idea of indirectly, how is it kind of affecting our results? And, therefore, if our ability to perform is impaired, then that's not going to have a great impact on our body composition as a whole, because, well, when we diet down, we're not just looking to lose weight in general. We obviously want to, lose fat, preserve our muscle mass. So unless
insulin's actually really useful for that as well, by the way.
Yeah.
Because insulin has an anti-catabolic effect. And in some circumstances, insulin can even be anabolic as well. So, in fact, some people like to call it the most anabolic hormone. I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, but the overall point is still valid. So, actually, again, this is why eating carbohydrate can actually have some. Sorry to interrupt, but I just thought of a point.
No, it's good.
So, basically, carbs have what you call a protein sparing effect.
Oh, yes, good one. Good one.
If you eat higher carbohydrates, because you get this anti-catabolic, possibly even anabolic effect, you actually need lesser protein requirements. So that is, again, really useful information to understand, especially if you're trying to keep muscle in a deficit. Because, again, obviously, if you want to keep muscle, then you need to stimulate this anabolic response in the first place. So, yeah, the carbohydrates are also really beneficial in that sense as well.
Yeah, that's good. Good one to bring up. I think it could potentially be worth going a little anecdotal at this point, because I think we kind of touched on some of the ideas of kind of protein intake and kind of carbs and the indirect impacts on training and stuff. So I guess people will also want to kind of hear our say on things as well, as opposed to just kind of fact. So this is where I'm going to throw it out there, that I've played around like a lot because I mean I find it a bit of a nightmare to gain weight. You see me eat like a pretty hefty amount of calories yourself as well, of course. You definitely have some pretty hefty caloric demands.
Yeah.
And this is, I think this is a good one, especially for the people listening who are trying to build muscle and kind of considering, well, they heard what we said earlier about kind of fat being higher in calories per gram, and kind of the idea of higher energy environment being ideal for muscle gain. But consider the impacts of carbohydrates on performance and stuff, and therefore how that will sort of carry over in terms of muscle gain. Because I mean, I myself have definitely played around with kind of higher fat versus higher carb in terms of pushing up phases. Because sure, is it much easier to get your calories in if you're on like 5,000 calories and you're having a much higher fat intake to facilitate that? Yeah, of course it's easier. The volume of food is much less. It's going to be much easier to get down there. But in terms of how you can really enhance your uptake of carbohydrates, how it can impact your performance, I think I've certainly experienced much better results when taking kind of the much higher carb route. And to be fair, all I'll advise there is don't underestimate the power of liquid calories, and don't underestimate the power of just ever so slightly increasing your portions. So if you're on some sort of chicken and rice meal, whether that be like a curry, a stir fry, whatever you're kind of making of it, just consider literally every few weeks another 10 grams of rice, another 10 grams of rice. Just titrate it up, because again, the idea of digestion and appetite comes into play. We have to actually be able to eat and digest and absorb what we actually want to use. So yeah, I think these are good ideas to always kind of come back to. And if we are considering how these macronutrients are important to us, then it's also worth considering how we're actually applying this in our diet. So those are just kind of my 2 cents on what I've found quite effective in terms of building and gaining phases, and kind of how I play about with my food to ensure that I can actually just continue getting it in.
Yeah, and that sort of,
you want to add to that?
Well, that's all very nicely leads into talking about fat. So in a gaining phase, for example, if we really get into the nuances of body composition, which again, this is a ratio of fat mass to lean body tissue, but just think of it as muscle. Fat is more easily stored as body fat. So if you're pushing up and go with this higher fat approach, even though if the calories are equated, you're probably going to have slightly worse body composition, simply because the fat you eat is, again, has this lower thermic effect, but it's also in terms of structure, the actual chemical structure of the fat itself is pretty much identical to that of stored body fat for the majority of fat you eat, and that's in the form of triacylglycerides. So don't need to go too much into that, but again, understanding if that's the case, that the chemical structure is very similar and it has a lower thermic effect food, then it means it's not going to take many calories to digest it, but it's also pretty much very easily stored as body fat because it doesn't have to go through any sort of conversion process, which again costs energy. So from a real nuanced standpoint, this is why going higher fat is probably not going to be beneficial for body composition in a push-up phase. Even though the calories are easy to get in, even though it's more calorie dense and easy to get in, again, from a body composition standpoint. Now, do the majority of people need to worry about that? Probably not, but it's just good to put out there so people understand.
Yeah, for sure.
So obviously fat is really important for quite a few things. Again, you've probably heard, hormones, your sex hormones come from cholesterol in the first place. In terms of is also nutrient uptake. It's also there is certain fat soluble nutrients which means they require fat to absorb, so that's important to understand, and nutrient storage as well. So obviously things like vitamin D you can store within your body fat, and obviously as you lose body fat it gets released. It is still an energy source, so that's definitely the case. In fact, right now in this current moment, me and Kev are probably majority of our energy is coming from fat source. So at rest, it's your main energy source, and any aerobic pathways your main energy source. So that just means with oxygen. Another one people don't consider is how it affects things like cell health and protects the cells, essentially, because you have something called the myelin sheath, which is essentially a fat coating around cells to help protect those cells. So again, that's really, really important. So fat does have quite a few important biological functions, that's for sure. But outside of them, it becomes less important for things like, again, for performance. You only need so much. Again, it's more. Fat's one of those where it's more about a minimum requirement for health. It's like a minimum requirement for health. It's less important for these extra things you want to do, like such as build muscle, perform in the gym, or even fat loss itself. Again, so if you just you hit a minimum requirement for fat per day, then you're golden. Now, again, this leads very nicely into how we can structure our macronutrients to make up our total calories. So for something like fat, at most, you probably only want to go as high as 1 gram per kilogram of body weight at most. So if you were a 100 kilogram person, that's 100 grams of fat per day. You don't need to go any higher than that. There's literally just no need. You could even go a little bit lower than that. In fact, the range is probably around 0.5 to 1 gram per kilogram per day. Women probably need a little bit higher. Men can probably get away with a bit lower. But yeah, that's the range, okay? So then if we look at, say, protein, we've kind of touched on it before. Now, I don't think there's a need to go ultra high, but again, there's benefits to going high. So in terms of ratios, probably about 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So again, if you were this 100 kilogram person, that's about 180 to 220 grams per day. And then obviously those between them have a calorie intake or make up a calorie number. So obviously again, protein 4 calories per gram.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Fat 9 calories per gram. So then obviously, those numbers make up this calorie value, and the rest of your calories can just simply be filled with carbohydrates. And that's simply how you need to structure your macronutrient intake. Simple as that. Now, obviously,
I was thinking about pounds. Because I was still thinking use kilograms per. You do grams per kilo of body weight.
Yeah.
And I always go grams per pound of body weight.
Yeah.
So
because metric system and all, I always use kilograms.
It all works out the same.
So now again, understanding that the rest of your calories can be filled by carbohydrates, your protein intake and your fat intake are going to be reasonably fixed. Not completely, but they're going to be reasonably fixed. So this is where we look at, again, if we look at to build a calorie intake, this is where, because the rest of your calories are filled by carbs, if you want to then start to build a calorie intake, this is where you can then, titrate up your carbohydrate intake as well. Again, that's going to come with a lot of benefits again in terms of like this anti-catabolic effect or possibly anabolic effect, this benefit of performance. Again, you get to eat more food, you have higher energy levels because you're eating more of this, again, this very energy dominant fuel source. So again, I think that's why it's important to understand, because it helps you realize if you want to build your calories, you can just build your carbs, and protein and fat are going to stay relatively fixed. Now, again, as you become heavier, if that's your goal, then obviously, again, those values of protein and fat are going to go up a little bit, but not very much over time. So again, if you're a 100-kilogram person and you get to 105 kilograms, you probably don't even need to change your protein or fat intake, because it's still going to be around that number of, again, for fat, what 1 gram per 1 gram per kilogram body weight, and for protein 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. It's still going to be around that number anyway. So again, that just should help you to understand if you're going to build calories, it just means to build your carbohydrates. And again, that just comes with a lot of benefits in and of itself. Again, one of them could be, creating an efficient diet start point, or could be for muscle building, whilst, maximize body composition, or whatever reason it could be for. But again, it's just useful to know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, going back to the ideas of, how I've kind of played around with, macros in the past, that idea of, really play around with your carbohydrates and keep your protein and fat reasonably fixed is a good one, not only for the reasons you mentioned, but then that also, if you keep, particularly fat more kind of fixed, then you can always really save that as kind of a last ditch effort. If you're really kind of at the peak of a gaining phase, and digestion, you maybe don't have the appetite to eat much more in terms of volume, so maybe that's the point where you could kind of creep up your fat just to create that kind of slightly higher calorie intake. Maybe you're not in a point where you want to kind of throw in a tidy up phase just yet. Maybe you don't want to kind of decrease body weight just yet, and even though that obviously would potentially be good in terms of kind of appetite. So this is where you can kind of consider how you really, play your cards in terms of these phases. But I think that's probably a good way to kind of wrap up macronutrients and how we're kind of structuring those in our diet. So perhaps just a quick little bit on micronutrients, because we're already kind of going quite far on time.
So this is where the argument of, how much you eat versus food quantity versus food quality comes to place. There shouldn't be an argument about that. There shouldn't be one or the other. You should have both. Both matter for health, for performance, for fat loss. Both absolutely matter. So you definitely, again, fortunately, the way things have worked out is, for example, going back to the higher protein intake, but then again, to low risk of cancer, you want a higher veg intake. Fortunately, the way you should typically structure your diet for better health and things like that anyway should end up meaning that the majority of your diet is quality anyway. Now, obviously, you want to get the majority of your micronutrients from your diet. Now, obviously, you could go down the supplemental route, but you do want to get the majority from your diet. Now, micronutrients are incredibly important. Again, don't undervalue what they can do. Again, there are so many different biochemical reactions that happen in your body every single day, which rely on micronutrients. So, for example, something like magnesium, which is a very abundant micronutrient, but a lot of people are deficient in, is critical for things like sleep. So you have basically your energy system comes from something called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Now, when you get a buildup of energy over day, you get this buildup of adenosine, and this buildup of adenosine essentially helps to create this, what you would call sleep pressure, which helps you to fall asleep. Now, a really important cofactor, which essentially is something that helps your body to perform this biochemical process, is magnesium, because that helps with this adenosine buildup. Side note, that's how caffeine works, by the way, because caffeine stops this adenosine buildup. But yeah, something like magnesium is incredibly important for something as simple as sleep. We know how important sleep is for things like body composition, performance, cravings, hunger. So again, that's just one function. That's one micronutrient and one function of that micronutrient that already should tell you how incredibly important it is. So yeah, micronutrients are very, very important. Again, the simple way, again, in terms of a real life practicality, is eat your veg, eat your fruit, and eat a wide range of colors of fruit and veg as well. Mostly green, but also get that wide range of colours in as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. In reality, there probably isn't too much that we can touch on in terms of fundamentals of micronutrients, because what they do is so incredibly diverse. But I guess the way to sum that up is just various bodily functions. So get them in, eat your fruit and veg. I think one point that's kind of worth highlighting, because I think we'll probably touch on micronutrients as a whole much more in kind of the advanced nutrition, because I think there's a lot of cool stuff that comes into
play. You can really dive into the different processes and stuff.
Yeah, because I know particularly you know some like really cool things about kind of what inhibits what in the body and stuff like that. So that'll be some really cool stuff to dive in the advanced section. For now, in terms of fundamentals, there's not too much to dive to, but I guess one thing which could potentially be good to wrap up on is when it does come to micronutrition, I guess particularly when it comes to supplementation, is this idea that because they're involved in so many different bodily processes, and particularly kind of minerals can come in many different forms, particularly looking at things like magnesium, and this is kind of a bit of a running joke that Ben and I have now, and for now you probably won't get it, but when we release the Fitbits that we did on stress management, it'll become clear why we talk about this. But for example, things like considering what form of magnesium you take, like whether it's magnesium oxide or magnesium bisglycinate, they do contribute to two very different functions in the body. If you know what that is, and you can kind of catch on to why this is a bit of a running joke now, feel free to leave that in the comments if you know kind of what these different forms of magnesium are used for. It'd be cool to see if anyone knows that. But yeah, particularly when it comes to supplementation, do consider micronutrients, vitamins, minerals are involved in so many kind of bodily functions that please consider what you're taking and why.
Well, this is why I don't actually like to talk about supplements and micronutrients in a generic sense, because number one, it's very individual, and again, supplements supplements are there to supplement your diet. They're help to fill in the missing pieces or the missing or maybe as an insurance policy. But when you start talking about supplements, that's when, again, because that's when things tend to get a bit more complicated. Whereas if you just ensure that you're eating quality sources of first of all, certain animal products are very, very nutrient dense. A good piece of steak, eggs, liver, or organ meat, very, very nutrient dense. So, include some of them in your diet. But then again, just looking at fruits and veg, it just becomes, if you just make sure you eat mostly green, but still have that wide variety of color, you're going to cover majority of your bases right there, and therefore you have to worry about supplements way less, and therefore it's just way less complicated. Because again, if you go high dose of one supplement, you could, if you go high dose with one nutrient but in supplement form, you could potentially start to deplete another nutrient, and again that could cause all sorts of problems. So things become more messy, becomes more complicated, and need to be done way more on an individual level when we talk about supplements. In fact,
for sure,
we shouldn't even really talk about micronutrients and supplements in the same sentence too much, because then you just start to associate, well, that's where I get my micronutrients from. No, definitely good quality food first to get in a range of micronutrients. Again, the reason why I say things like animal products are useful as well, because you're going to find a lot more fat soluble vitamins within your animal products. You will get some in veg as well, like avocado, for example, is pretty high in fat soluble nutrients, but you will find, again, things like B vitamins, which are quite hard to get from a diet. You'll find them more so in organ meat. So don't neglect the animal product side of things either. But, if you have, again, just good quality source of animal products, which also come with better quality source of protein themselves, and you have plenty of fruits and veg in, then you're going to be, like I say, pretty well covered. And I think for the majority of people, that's where you can stop. You don't need to go any further. Again, supplements then come down to the individual level, and I think that's just important to remember as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously it is worth noting simply that supplements are exactly that, a supplement. But the only reason I kind of mention that is because a lot of people already do kind of take something like a multivitamin and stuff for kind of more so an insurance policy and to kind of fill in potential gaps. But I would just like to therefore highlight and understand that various even when we kind of, again, we get into this on the stress management videos, but the idea of just consider what you're taking and what form it's in, because even I guess this even applies to diet as well, but particularly when it does come to supplementation, especially, you know, to kind of cover gaps. You know, people often kind of go for like cheap multivits from, you know, I won't say names of shops or brands, but, you know, they won't even like look at they won't even like look at the form of the vitamin in said multivit, and can you even actually really efficiently absorb that vitamin. And, you know, again, you're thinking of like different minerals, like, you know, magnesium and the different things that does in your body, kind of methylated versus unmethylated. But we'll kind of get into more of that in the advanced section. It's just something that I wanted to bring up in terms of just, you know, be wary of, you know, what you're consuming and why you're consuming it.
So here's another major problem with relying on something like a multivitamin for your nutrient intake, because this is where people miss a key part of the puzzle. Yes, you're getting in some of those micronutrients with a multivitamin, but what you're not getting that you will get with food is phytonutrients, polyphenols, different types of fibers, so soluble, insoluble, prebiotic, all these different things that work synergistically and are important by themselves that come with food that you're not going to get with a multivitamin, that you're going to miss out on. It's massive. So you're going to miss out on just so much of what you get from food by just taking a multivitamin. So again, but then what you think as well, I've got this as an insurance policy, I'm covered, I don't need to worry about as much about veg anymore. Again, that's problematic thinking, because you're just missing out on a lot there. So again, that's really, again, why it just keeps things simple to mainly just eat your fruit and veg, and again, good quality source of animal products, because it covers everything, not just your micronutrients, but like say your phytonutrients, your polyphenols, you know, different types of fiber, which again is really, really important for obviously the gut microbiome. As we talked about before, the gut can then have effects on both carries in and carries out as well. Now, we're not getting to that because that's very complicated to the point where I shouldn't even be talking about it really, because even the experts in the world on the gut are still not that sure of just everything. It is very fascinatingly complicated. There's so much not known. It's incredible. So, but what we can pretty much confidently say is that, you know, certain fibers, especially prebiotic fibers, which are basically fibers that feed the gut microbiome, are very good for our health and have beneficial effects on our health. So you're not getting that with a multivitamin. So again, this is why it's really important to not just think micronutrients and then think multivitamin, because you're missing out so much more. And again, that's just key to understand.
Yeah, well, that's why I kind of like to bring that up very quickly, you know, the idea of kind of supplementation for micronutrients, because I think that's usually the first thing that's kind of neglected in a diet. And, you know, whether or not, you know, prospective clients come with already kind of a lower protein intake, you know, that's usually something that's, you know, very, you know, easily addressed. But usually something that people really neglect is kind of their fruit and veg intake, and almost do sort of start to rely on supplements, which is again why it's kind of important to consider, you know, what is problematic. I can't remember what I was actually going to say now, but I think I guess most of the stuff out of the way for kind of micronutrients and stuff without going too in depth. And we've already been going at this for a while, so I suppose this is a decent place to kind of wrap up.
Just sum up everything we've talked about.
Yeah, so I guess to sum up, energy balance is key.
As a fundamental
don't neglect don't neglect the relationship, you know, between calories in and calories out, and, you know, don't abuse that. High protein, especially if you're, you know, wanting to optimize body composition, is the way to go. Take advantage of the low hanging fruit in terms of like distribution of protein and stuff like that. It is a lot easier to think.
One thing I just want to add to why distribution of protein is also quite important that we didn't add before is that protein doesn't really have, like carbs and fat doesn't really have a method of storage. Now there is like an amino acid pool, but in terms of overall, there isn't really a way to store protein. So that's why we said, you know, anywhere between 3 to 6 meals or 3 to 6 servings of protein per day is important, because again, you know, once it's sort of out your system, so to speak, that's when you need to stimulate that protein threshold again. But carry on.
Now, a brilliant one to bring up actually. Carbs are not bad for you. Carbs are probably very useful in terms of kind of body composition and performance. Fats, I guess this one goes a little anecdotal, but, you know, although important, we personally prefer kind of keeping fats to a minimum just to kind of cover all their, bodily
Cover
processes.
the basis, and that's it.
Important in your diet, but consider how you can potentially play around with them, but again, don't really overdo it. And
again,
then eat your damn fruits and vegetables.
Yeah. So again, one last point to add to the fats argument is that, to be fair, again, sustainability is really important. So if you do prefer going high fat, low carb, that's absolutely fine as well. If you prefer going high carb, low fat, that's absolutely fine. So again, that's just important to remember, because the sustainability side of things is also critical. So yes, and eat your damn fruits and vegetables. Like, my God, eat your protein, eat your cake, but eat your damn fruit and vegetables as well. Okay, that's so important. But again, quick caveat on that is, if you're someone that's pretty much never eats veg, if you just go from eating no veg to try and eating like 5+ servings a day, you will have some serious digestive issues. So build that up slowly as well. But yes, pretty much.
And actually, one last one on the fruit and veg. Smoothies, man. The amount of kind of hassle that could be solved by smoothies.
Easy option.
I totally get that people, again, maybe especially as kind of food intake gets higher. This is just kind of a bit of a practical takeaway. As food intake gets very high and you kind of don't want to eat anymore, but we're going to do a whole video on kind of maximizing nutrient intake. But so we'll expand on that more. But just as kind of a practical takeaway from this one in terms of fruits and veg, smoothies, you can just plug a ton of micronutrients into a blender and just
so easy.
Don't discount something as simple as that.
Blender, not a juicer, though. Blender, not a juicer. That's important to remember as well. And that's pretty much, that is the fundamentals of nutrition.
Fundamentals. Yeah. So hopefully we've kind of given you some fish and taught you how to fish as well.
Yep.
After this, we'll be going on to fundamentals of lifestyle management, I guess, something that Ben and I are probably going to have to try even harder to not dive into, because that's probably our favorite topic to talk about. I guess something that's massively overlooked. So we hope you've enjoyed this one. You've been able to take away a lot from it, and thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.
Thank you for watching. See ya.